Assalamu alaikum and welcome to today's session. Before we begin, could you please let me know if you can hear me loud and clear? Okay, a couple more. All right. Begin. First of all, thank you for being here for this webinar, because at the moment we have parents who have joined us from different time zones. It is UK, US, Italy, Indonesia, Singapore, Maldives, Canada, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, all of them. And it feels like it's like the global audience right here, alhamdulillah. In fact, one of the mothers who wanted to attend the session, she asked us to give her a missed call in case her alarm clock decides to act up. SubhanAllah. But what this really shows is that how invested you are in trying to understand your teens and parent them in a way that puts them and you at ease, inshallah. To be honest, there isn't really a rule book that says how we can parent our children. There isn't a one size fits all ever when it comes to parenting. But that doesn't mean there is no help out there. You know, there is something very beautiful about our religion, wherein the Prophet ﷺ, he left us with the ultimate advice that can benefit every living soul on this earth. He said, Allahu fi awni al-abdi ma kana al-abdu fi awni akhihi. Allah is helping the servant as long as the servant is helping his brother. And subhanAllah, who wouldn't want Allah to help them? And this help is so vast. It's not restricted to just one realm. It's everywhere, and it applies to parenting as well. And of course, we have one such parent with us here today, who are also the organizers of today's event, the founder and CEO of Muslim Kids TV, Brother Abdurrahman Milo, along with his wife, Sister Claudia, who have parented 4 teens, alhamdulillah. Brother Abdurrahman, would you like to tell us briefly how your journey has been raising your teens in the West?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Just like to say thank you for everyone in attending the seminar. We appreciate, everyone across the world, the different time zones, and the sacrifice of having to, wake up at an early hour in the middle of the night to attend. And, we would like to, of course, thank Dr. Saleem for being willing to share his expertise with all of us. It's not easy. Parenting children and parenting teens is even actually a little bit more difficult, at least in our experience. And I'd like to also thank the whole team that put the webinar together. Without all of that wonderful marketing team and all of the team behind Muslim Kids TV, events like this would not be possible. And, we wouldn't be able to bring together a community of concerned parents to, share ideas and, share their experiences and learn from each other. I mean, just briefly, our own self, I think a couple of things that are most important about raising teens is, one, is patience. It's going to be a difficult journey. It is a difficult journey. And we just have to be patient, trust Allah, and make a lot of dua, both for our kids and for ourselves, that we're doing it correctly. And, I think a big part of it is the foundation that we lay for the children as they are children, or the foundation we lay for our teens when they are children. And, that's the whole purpose that we started Muslim Kids TV, is to lay that foundation for kids. And, we would just like to encourage everyone, if you're not familiar with Muslim Kids TV and what it offers, please, take this opportunity after the webinar to learn about it, because it is a tool that can help lay that foundation for when the kids get to teens and they become a lot more confused about who they are, And so with that, I'd just really like to thank again everyone for attending, and thank Dr. Saleem for being sharing his knowledge with us today.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair, Brother Abdurrahman. So, just as a special offer and a special gift for all the audience that are over here, you can use this coupon code for a 20% discount on all your MKTV subscriptions, inshallah. So, dear parents, rather than trying to figure out what we are doing wrong, let's grab on to what we can do right. And for this, we have with us today Dr. Saleem Al Nuaimi to share with us super valuable insights on how to deal with teens and even those of your children who are about to step into this phase, inshallah. But before you get mesmerized by strategies, ideas, and inputs on this topic, a little bit about Dr. Saleem Al Nuaimi. He is an MD, MSc, FRCPC, is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist at Hamad Medical Corporation in Qatar. He is an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College and holds a Master of Science in Neurochemistry from the University of Alberta as well. Dr. Nuaimi's special interest is in neuropsychiatric developmental disorders, psychotherapy, and has also established the Research Committee for Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. He's also quite passionate about the relationships between technology, nutrition, teenage issues, and our mental health. MashaAllah. Allahumma barik lak. Sisters, this webinar is open to both parents, so you can have your spouse along with you to listen to what Dr. Saleem has to share with us. So for the next 60 minutes, you will inshallah witness a drastic change in your relationship with your teenager in a positive way, of course. And just a quick reminder to the audience, you can post your questions in the chat box and Dr. Saleem will be taking them towards the end of the session. And this applies to our audience who have tuned in through YouTube as well. We will answer all your questions, so make use of the YouTube chat box out there. Dr. Saleem, the stage is all yours.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. First off, Assalamu alaikum everybody. I'm very humbled to have parents join us from all across the globe. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless you all and your families and your children. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq today. So I was asked to speak about this kind of difficult topic around teenagers, and I wanted to give various insights, inshallah, with regards to teenagers from kind of a medical mental health perspective, but also from kind of a philosophical religious perspective. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I'm not being, paid or coaxed or anything like that to do this. Jazakumullah khair. Next slide, please. So this topic is extremely huge. There is a lot of interest. I've worked a lot and extensively with Muslim communities, both in the East and the West. And there's lots and lots of questions and concerns, and there's books written about this stuff from our Salaf and currently. So I'm just going to try to speak about things from my areas of expertise. We're going to look first off with regards to the mental health aspects with regards to the teenage brain. The second thing I wanted to really talk about is a little bit about electronic and social media use. I'm going to look at sort of areas of common challenges that parents face and about collaborating with our teens more so. And then I have a final note about the intersection of philosophy and religion, and you'll see how that's very important in answering a lot of the other questions that were sort of brought up. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I see lots and lots of teenagers and their families for a variety of reasons. The majority of the times, they're not related to mental health problems. They think they have mental health problems, but it's usually parenting, school, bullying, other sort of social issues. And really what I start off with saying is that it's really hard, subhanAllah, being a teenager these days. Lots of pressures from societies globally. And I also tell teenagers that it's really hard for their parents to parent them as well. So I think we just need to start off with that sort of kind of mindset to start with, that this is a difficult task on both ends of the spectrum. Next slide, please. So just a very quick, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but subhanAllah, the brain, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating it in the fetus, think of it as a pencil. It's kind of like a cylinder kind of pencil. And as the child grows and is born, this pencil starts to open up like this. Yeah, it kind of starts to open up and it grows from the inside out. And then the brain starts to enlarge in size in early childhood. Now, what ends up happening is you can see here the colored regions, right? So these sort of colored regions, you have this blue region, this purple region. The main areas we want to focus on are basically the thalamus. Think of the thalamus as sort of like the stairs. It's kind of the gateway connection between this bottom part or this inner part of the brain and the outside part of the brain. So the outside part of the brain we'll refer to as the cortical areas, and then basically the inside part is the subcortex, the inside parts. So the amygdala and the hippocampus are really the main two areas that we've explored, and lots of research has been done where they regulate things like your emotions, threat perception, memory, while subhanAllah, the sort of prefrontal cortex areas, which is sort of like just around here, and the frontal areas, even in our Arabic language, we call it the nasiya, right? And in nasiya, where we have a dua where we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take us by our nasiya to him, because the nasiya is our area of rational judgment. It's sort of our awareness of consciousness. It's where our values and morality sort of develops, and logic. So in a nutshell, what ends up happening in the teenage years, there's a differentiation in that development, subhanAllah. So the inside part of the brain develops by the time the kids hit to teenage years, but the cortical part and the nasiya part is still under development for about another, probably decade. So there's this differentiation and maturation, and this is probably one of the main reasons, and we're just talking about normal, healthy, teenagers, that there is a significant difficulty in managing and dealing with them. Because the amygdala and the hippocampus, they're all responding in the here and now. They're emotional, they're reactive, and they are responding here and now without understandings of context or social context or right and wrong. They don't deal with any of that stuff. And the thalamus connects that information with the top part of the brain. So for example, let's say my mom calls me and says, hey, do the dishes. So I hear, hey, do the dishes. My amygdala gets fired and says, oh, she's asking something from me. Oh, why does she want me to get up? Oh, I'm playing a video game. Oh, I'm doing this. Oh, get up and pray. Oh, I don't want to do, and the emotions start right off the bat. But there is not enough connectivity for the front part to put the brakes on to say, hey, this is a task you need to do, or just help your mom out. This is morally correct, whatever. That connection is not there. So you'll sort of see some of the challenges. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the discrepancies that we see, we refer to that very loosely. When there's a discrepancy, think of it as the bottom part or the downstairs part of the brain and the upstairs part of the brain. That discrepancy, we label that executive function deficits. So executive functions is basically what the word means. Executive are higher level tasks, brain tasks, the stuff we talked about in the frontal sort of low prefrontal cortex, and the kind of controlling the other emotional, more raw parts of the brain. So when there's this disconnection, we basically get the following major kind of concerns that we see. Next slide, please. So basically, planning and sequencing is usually not done properly because the emotional aspects kind of get triggered first and the planning kind of comes later. So this is another sign. We have another slide about impulsivity. So a lot of teenagers usually make not very good decisions for themselves. And this is one of the main reasons why. Next slide, please. There's another area very important here where we call it cognitive flexibility. And kids who typically have these executive function difficulties, just because it's a natural process of development, they're typically a lot more stubborn. So you'll see teenagers are really stubborn, and sometimes they're just stubborn for the sake of being stubborn rather than for actual any reason. So this is one way to understand sort of stubbornness in teenagers. Next slide, please. So emotion regulation is a very important aspect as well. And we talked about the amygdala, how it just sort of responds to the environment without giving context. The other thing that we also need to recognize is lots of youth, the youth period is also about major hormonal changes. So with females, it's estrogen changes, and with males, it's testosterone-based changes, which also significantly affect emotional regulation as well. Next slide, please. And we talked very briefly with regards to impulse control. So again, one of the key things to notice here is that's why, subhanAllah, the youth time period is very critical. If you see, the number one cause, of death in youth is actually accidents, trauma. So it's usually accidental deaths. They're doing something they shouldn't be doing, usually driving, speeding, doing like risk-taking behaviors. You'll see in youth, the impulse control issues results in them getting into drug use. So, drug use is a youth, young adult problem. It's not really a problem for people in their 50s or 40s even. So this issue of the impulse control is a major area of concern, and it's related again to that disconnection. Next slide, please. So the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about the neurobiology and then tie that in to what we see sometimes as parents, right? A lot of the times I'd say the number one complaint that I get from parents is that the teenagers are, have respect problems. They don't listen, they talk back, they want to do their own thing, they're stubborn, they don't want to pray, they don't want to do certain things about morality or social cultural things. It's really all around this concept of respect. And I just wanted to talk very quickly about this. We can look at disrespectful behavior in a variety of ways. I would say probably the most common sort of difficulties is this process of what we call as projection. So teenagers, by definition, are actually quite powerless. If you think about it, they act very powerful because they want to project that they're powerful, but they're actually very powerless. And, they still need their parents. They still need their parents to buy them stuff. They can't fully support themselves. And they're in that transition period of developing autonomy. There's a psychologist by the name of Erickson who talks a lot about sort of these psychological developments in people, and autonomy is a very important one when it comes to youth. They want to differentiate themselves from their families and their parents and create a sense of self. And that comes with struggle because they need to disconnect from the parents and create their own sense of belonging. So they actually project powerlessness onto the parents, which basically means that they make us as parents feel terrible and make us feel powerless. And it always feels like they're pushing boundaries. So then we have to reassert our power, and it becomes a power struggle. But just understanding the fact that they're just powerless and they're trying to push our buttons sometimes, just that in of itself can help reduce a lot of issues around disrespect and conflict. A lot of times youth struggle with feeling accepted in conformity and feeling like they need that from their families as well. One that I didn't put here that I should have put as a note is disrespectful behavior can also be a sign of like a mental health problem, specifically depression. Youth with depression typically present as very irritable and problematic. As well as high disorders of anxiety. Anxiety disorders can actually be that. So we always have to think about, is there something else going on rather than they're just being disrespectful because they're teenagers and they need more discipline, for example. And then the last point is this differentiation. So conformity for youth is very important, but again, they need to differentiate themselves from their parents. And that's why you'll see, for example, there is many hadiths about the importance of friends. That the one's friends is like a reflection of their religion and their manners and their morality. Because what ends up happening in our fitrah, we want to conform. Youth want to conform. They want to conform with whoever is the strongest, with whoever is the smartest, with whoever is the richest, with whoever is the powerful person, because they feel powerless. Yeah. And they don't want to conform with their parents because they have to differentiate from them. So that's why the community and what we call in Arabic, the bi'a, or the community or the friendships or the social network, is very, very important. And this is typically what leads a lot of youth, unfortunately, astray and into lots of problems. So, the common thing is, I remember, like, if my dad told me something, I'd never listen to it. But if my dad's friend or my friend, his father, told me the exact same thing my dad told me, I'd do it just because it wasn't my dad. So it comes from this sort of psychological understanding. Wallahu alam. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, I'm just going to talk very briefly about sort of the strategies that we use to help with this executive function. So remember, we talked about how the top and the bottom part of the brain are they're differentiated and they mature at different rates. And these are some of the problems that can happen from it. And these are the concerns. So we're just going to talk very briefly about, like, how do we manage this aspect in a general sense of the word, because basically the teens need time. And I'm glad Michael, talked about this, where, being patient, because time does heal and helps the brain differentiate and mature more. But we just have to do it in a safe way. So one of the most important things, is looking at reward systems, and specifically positive and negative reinforcement. And this is purely behavioral science. You reward positive behaviors and you sort of punish negative behaviors. And we usually talk about punishing not in the affirmative. So you don't add a punishment. Usually that's not the best way. So adding punishments is things like hitting. You're adding something to the child, or giving something negative to the child. Usually what we talk about is negative punishment, which is you take something away that they like. So you restrict their whatever things that they enjoy, taking away their privileges, stuff like that. I think one of the most important things to recognize is that reinforcement needs to be frequent, small, and consistent. A lot of times I think parents get into trouble with either giving too big rewards, and then the child has this kind of spoiled mentality where he can get big in things and it's quite costly. And a lot of the times youth, they get punished for too long. They get their whatever devices taken for like a long period of time. Well, they need kind of more consistent, small, positive feedback and consistent, small punishments. And it could be simply as a word. It could be a small thing like a dessert. It could be whatever, small things just in general. Next slide, please. I can't stress this one enough. The concept of structure and routine for youth is very, very important in keeping them busy. So I believe it was Abu Hanifa, or one of the scholars from the Hanafiya. They said that if you are using your time in righteousness, you can't be using it in evil. So it's this opportunity cost. If your youth is engaged in positive behaviors, by definition and by default, they can't be engaged in negative behaviors. And that's the same for us as well, right? If I'm doing something positive, I can't be doing something negative at the same time, albeit like whatever our intentions, inshallah, all our intentions are well. So having a routine, consistency, as simple as like a structure in their wake up time, sleep time, curfew time, activities, the type of activities that they do, and just kind of keeping them busy. It's when you let youth have a lot of free time and they don't know what to do with it, and we'll talk about supervision as well, just a lot of this completely unsupervised time, especially with electronic devices. That's when a lot of youth start running into problems. Next slide, please. Emotional development, I think, is a very important aspect. A lot of the times, so I come from a Middle Eastern background. We have people with us today from all sorts of backgrounds, and I can, just imagine the differences and the similarities in the cultural ways of raising kids. But, we grew up, like you don't talk back to your parents. You don't, express yourself in any way, and that's actually problematic, because that actually does result in a lot of passive aggressive behaviors down the road. even though on the surface things seem okay, but underneath it's actually not a good way. So emotional development is a little bit kind of different. It's, for example, let's say your youth is raising their voice at you, right? We all know that this is not permissible either from a religious aspect or from a cultural aspect, right? Instead of getting into a power struggle with them immediately and shutting them down, this is the first strategy. It's called name it and tame it. So name it means name the emotion. So you could say something like, you're sort of raising your voice at me. I wonder what you're feeling. If they can't sort of express what they feel, number one, to me, I think that's an issue. Like, why can't, 14-year-old sort of say, yeah, I'm kind of angry with you, mom, or I'm kind of angry with you, dad. So when they name it, that then allows them to tame it, because then they're connecting. It's connecting their frontal lobe with their emotions. So their emotion is angry and frustrated because you told them something they didn't want to do or whatever. But when you can actually get them to name it, that already calms the system down a little bit, and then they can then tame it. They can be like, okay, I'm kind of angry now. Then there's another aspect, which is we call connect and redirect. This is actually very important. You'll actually see a lot of these aspects, subhanAllah, like even though this is relatively new knowledge, like in the past 20, 30 years in psychology, this is very old when it comes to our Islamic heritage. Like for example, Imam Shafi'i has a book about how to give nasiha, when to give nasiha, how to give advice. And one of the key aspects of giving advice is you give advice when someone is calm. You don't give advice, you don't start advice giving when someone is in distress, whether that's in emotional distress or a financial distress or whatever type of distress that they're having, whether they're sad or grieving or too angry. So connecting, redirecting basically means when your youth is having an emotional episode, right? A lot of the times we as parents can't tolerate that. It makes us feel very uncomfortable that they're angry, that they're shouting, that they're crying, that they're yelling, that whatever, that they're grieving, that they tell you they're suicidal, they feel like their life is terrible. We have this need to fix it. But that's probably the farthest thing that you should be doing in that moment. In that moment, you connect. You say, okay, I understand. I may not understand why you're feeling sad, but I can see that you're sad. And you just sort of do what you do with someone who's sad. You give them a hug, you just sit beside them, you just listen, whatever, even if it doesn't make any sense to you, what they're saying, it doesn't matter, because that's the bottom part of their brain, just firing. It has no concept of context, just gibberish. You listen, they start to calm down, then you redirect. The redirection comes after the emotional state is calmer. So when someone's really angry, if you start getting angry, then they anger and then it escalates. But if you can de-escalate, they will de-escalate usually. They take a little bit of time. Oh, look, sounds like you're kind of angry. Maybe you should go to your room and just take a bit of a chill pill and then maybe come back and we can then talk about it. And that's the redirection. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm just aware of the time. We have a lot to cover. So some of the things, this picture didn't come out very clear. One of the things that I next want to talk about is, again, sort of ongoing strategies in looking at managing youth. Remember, we talked about the psychology of that power differential, right? So they're always trying to push the boundaries. So what's very important is you guys have to maintain boundaries as parents. And boundaries are there are, even in the hadith, there's a hadith in the 40 Nawawi hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet he talks about, just in summary, the halal and the haram are clear, right? There's very clear boundaries between the halal and the haram, and then there's a kind of the grayish area, and that we should avoid this grayish area. So the boundaries also in your household need to be clear. And I think there's a lot of unwritten rules, and then that sometimes causes confusion, especially between parents that are co-parenting, like if parents are divorced or separate households. Things need to be clear. There are very clear red lines in certain families, and then there are the little gray areas, and then there's the okay stuff. So at least make sure the okay stuff and the red lines are clear. And then the gray stuff, you have to pick and choose your battles. I think one of the major difficulties, and I said here, right, don't create arguments on every small thing, right? They're going to make mistakes. They have to make mistakes. Rabb al-Alameen said that we are going to make mistakes. And if we don't make mistakes, he'll get other people to come in our place and make mistakes and make istighfar. So they need to learn to make mistakes, to to learn from their mistakes. Also, using humor as a way of teaching, I think, is another very important thing. I think a lot of parents we're quite stressed out a lot of the times, and we just want kids to be kind of just do what they need to do, and we have other kids, they have other responsibilities, but sometimes just humor helps our own selves, our own nefs, and it also helps them sort of like learn a lesson, but without the necessarily same level of conflict. The last point here I wanted to put is the discipline is not personal. So our scholars, they actually have a conversation about whether or not, for example, it's permissible to hit children as like, I don't mean in an abusive way. I mean, like in a disciplinary way. There's actually a fiqhi difference of opinion if that's even permissible to hit children, young children, as part of their discipline. And the scholars that even said that it is permissible, like, you kind of hit the kid's hands gently and you use some sort of physical discipline. What was very interesting was that they said that it can't be from your own personal like anger. So the point is, discipline is not an outlet of your anger. Discipline is used to correct an inappropriate behavior. Yes, it may make us feel angry, or it may make us feel guilty or ashamed or whatever negative feeling. But the point is, you don't take that out on your child just so you feel better about it. And that's why discipline shouldn't be given when people are very, very angry, or, and we talked about the emotional development, right? Like to connect, redirect, taming emotions. The other things that are important is establishing a collaborative approach. This is very true, especially with children. I see lots of kids who have like ADHD and oppositional defiance. Collaborative management is what they call it, is very helpful. And what that means is you basically get the child to be involved, the youth to be involved in the rewards and punishments and the rules. So what are the red lines? What are the okay things to do? How do we negotiate? Sometimes it feels like parents give up power in this process. But trust me, you give up a little bit of power now to save yourself a lot of headache down the road. And then they choose their punishments and the rewards. So then when these things actually end up happening, the youth only has themselves really to blame. And it really takes away the blaming and vindictiveness and the manipulation that you can see a lot of times with youth. So I actually get parents to get them involved in things, get them involved in the household budget, get them involved in, like, I don't know, cooking and food, get them involved in their rewards and their punishments, in their study time, in their scheduling, as much as possible, and then give them choices, but make sure the choices are choices that you're okay with as well, so you don't get into a major conflict as well. Don't give them the full power to make choices. You can say, okay, you know what, choices 1, 2, 3 are okay to you as a parent. You may like choice 1 the most, but choice 2 and 3 are still okay. They're still within your boundaries, and giving them that sense of control. The last 2 are basically things that we should really avoid. I don't know, they're very common in Middle Eastern culture, and they're very detrimental, where the parents are constantly comparing their kids to other kids, comparing them to siblings, comparing them to so-and-so's sons and daughters. And all that does is it creates shame. And I know parents mean it well. They mean it in a good way. Like, it's not malicious. They want their kids to be better. But this shame-based approach, to be honest, is not the best if it's too consistent. Shame is good. We need to feel shame. We feel ashamed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we make istighfar. We feel ashamed from our parents. We feel ashamed from elderly individuals. We feel ashamed from people in the community. This is good. But if it becomes too persistent, then the child will be overridden with guilt and shame, and then they'll start to rebel. So, avoiding comparisons as much as possible is probably a good idea. Next slide, please. Also, I think parents and youth actually themselves, they typically struggle with focusing on the behavior. A lot of the times they focus on the other things, and parents do as well. So the youth will just be like, oh, this homework is dumb, or this is whatever. And they just start ranting about whatever, but they don't actually focus on the behavior. The behavior is like sitting and doing your homework. The behavior here, I just give a very quick example. A parent can give feedback just about the behavior. So you say things like, when you don't listen, I feel like you disrespect me, or when you yell at me, I feel like you don't care about me. That's the behavior. It's pointing out the specific behavior, that you're yelling, that you're that you're not listening about doing chores, that you don't come home on time, that you tell me off, whatever. Versus just this sort of, again, this expression of the anger, right? You never listen. You all should listen, and using religion against them, and what's wrong with you, and why can't you be like so and so, and your sister listens and your brother. It's not conducive, because it doesn't point out the specific behavior that the child is engaging in. The last 2 points, being calm and empathetic, and this is the hadith that I put. This hadith is in Sahih Muslim, that the Prophet ﷺ says, "Inna Allah rafiqun yuhibb al-rifqa fil amri kullih." That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is gentle, and He loves gentleness in all matters, in everything. Yes, there are times that we need toughness. There are times where we need to be very stern and rigid, and those are the boundaries, the red ones, right? Those are the red boundaries that we can't be crossing. But then the other sort of things, gentleness typically is a stronger door, a stronger path for people to be connected with. Overall, some kids know. Some kids, if you give them an inch, they take an arm, right? And the last point I want to say is take care of yourself. I think a lot of times parents, they start to miss the point of parenting. From a religious perspective, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to give tarbiyah and to raise our kids Islamically, and to raise them on knowing, and to raise them on learning life skills, and to raise them in a peaceful way. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't make us responsible for outcomes. And I think a lot of times we're very outcome driven. Our society is outcome driven. Capitalism is outcome driven. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on parents, and then it actually ruins the process, if that makes sense. Of course, we want positive outcomes. Like, I'm not saying that we don't want positive, we don't want our kids to be good, but we have to recognize what is in our control and what isn't. And if you do what you do, and you make it the proper intention, and you make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you yourself are a righteous person, that's what I mean by taking care of yourself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in Surah An-Nisa, I believe, Surah An-Nisa or Ma'idah, that فَمَنْ خَافَ مِنْ that the meaning, which is that if you left your like if you had a dhurriya after, if you have children after you, and you were fearful about them, فَلْيَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَلْيَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا, that you be pious and say the truth, or be a truthful person. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't say to us that if you're fearful of your children, and like you're worried about their future and their life and all those sort of things. That's what the verse is talking about. He didn't tell us to make sure they have, a piece of land and property and houses and X amount of dollars in the bank. He told us to be pious as parents. And we know that also in Surah Al-Kahf, about the father, the orphans that Sayyidina Musa and Al-Khidr, they built the wall to protect their wealth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا, that their father or their forefathers were righteous people. So taking care of yourself means you take care about your religion, your well-being, your physical health, and being a positive person yourself. And then I think that will impact the children quite positively. Next slide, please. Common mistakes. I think the one key, if the only thing you take away from today is, I would like you guys just to know that, like, khairul umur awsatuha, the best of actions is the middle. So too much or too little discipline, problematic. A lot of times we're too much into the discipline area, and at other times there's too little discipline. So we know, for example, from studies, that parents that provide a lack of supervision for their children are like multiple folds of falling into drug use problems. Parents who don't know who their kids hang out with, who their friends are, who their families are, what they're doing. There's just a lack of supervision generally, because they're like, oh, you know what, he needs to explore, he needs to figure himself out. I don't want to get into conflicts with him. Let him have his freedom. That sort of approach is too laid back. And then the other approach, which is not allowing children to explore and just being very strict and rigid, is also very problematic. I put a point here, which is, I found it quite important. this idea of priorities, and a lot of times they can be quite mixed up. Many of our parents, and as I can see, many of you are from very, very different parts in the world. Many parents are immigrants, or their parents were immigrants, and the kids are first or second generation children. A lot of times we focus like extensively on education, for example, which is fine. It's a good thing. We want our children to do well and to be educated and to have a good career, and they take by the asbab and to live comfortably, because many of us came from countries where we're very uncomfortable and unsafe. But it's almost to the detriment of other things, like their morality and their well-being. For example, they learn a couple languages, but they don't know Arabic. They can't read Quran. I had a case, I remember, of a young girl in university, and she wanted to get married. But there was this sort of cultural understanding that no, you have to finish your education, and the boy who comes to propose, he has to have a degree, and all this stuff. And because of these unnecessary delays, subhanallah, may Allah forgive her, she fell into zina, into fornication. So we need to have proper priorities as parents. Again, the hover parents, the perfectionistic parents versus the lack of supervision. Like, a lot of our parents are very perfectionistic. They want kids to be perfect. No one's going to have a perfect person. There is no such thing as a perfect person, except the Prophet ﷺ. After that, there's nothing. So just take that idea out of your head. The fix-some parents. Fix-some parents are parents who don't want their kids to make mistakes. Of course, again, we don't want our kids to make major mistakes that you can't sort of like bounce back from. But there are lots of opportunities for kids to make mistakes, like making their own choice about certain things in a day-to-day way that you don't think is the best. But instead of constantly being this advice giver and making sure that they don't fall into these problems that you may have fell into, they need to make those choices. If you think about it, like, we're at where we are at now because we've grown and experienced so many challenges in our life. They need to do the same in a safe way, in a safe environment. That don't take things personally. I think we talked about that. And this last point, don't use religion to control. I think we have a very complicated and misunderstood relationship with religion, where a lot of the times families are very dogmatic. I've done a lot of family work, family therapy, couples counseling, and religion is seen very dogmatically. And dogmatically just means like, this is just the way it is. There's like no understanding, no conceptualization, no fiqh. It's just X means X, Y is Y, black and white, that's it. Kids need to listen to their parents, and that's it. Birr al-walidain, and that's it. This sort of approach to things, I find, actually turns a lot of kids off from religion. And it's also, to me, it projects that parents are scared. Actually, being a very dogmatic in religion is a sign that you're actually unknowledgeable and you're quite scared about being challenged. While our religion, there's nothing to be worried about. Our religion's the same Quran from 1400 years. Our religion survived wars and philosophers, and it's the haqq. It doesn't matter. It's not going to change if someone challenges it or not. It's whether or not we can manage with our kids or not. I think that scares us as well. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we'll switch gears now. We're going to talk a little bit about social media and electronics and video gaming. There's lots of information here. I just put like 2 or 3 slides about this. This is a very interesting study. This was done in 2016. And basically, in a nutshell, what this study did is it took children between the ages of 5 and 17. They're all healthy kids. They don't have any mental health or learning or other difficulties. They used these different measuring points, and they used a kind of a special MRI kind of machine that looks at tissue density in the brain. And then they followed them over a period of 3 years, and they wanted to correlate findings with the daily average video gaming hours. And what they found was that if you played too much video games, it's just directly or indirectly was associated with actually less tissue density. So what that basically means is that excessive video gaming can actually affect brain regions. And they specifically mentioned here verbal intelligence, but it can affect lots of different brain regions. And maybe like excessive video gaming can actually lead to unfavorable cognitive outcomes, such as poor concentration, lack of interest in other activities, social skill deficits. I also want to say, though, that so this is one study. There are other studies, I didn't put it up, but that comes to my mind. There's one, remember we talked about the hippocampus, which is the memory area of the brain. If children played violent games that are sort of these mindless shooting violent games that don't have any sort of like critical thinking skills, that structure in the brain actually shrank on studies when they looked at it using MRIs. But if kids played like, these adventure puzzle games, creative games where there's thinking, critical thinking, that actually improved. So I don't want you guys taking the sense that, okay, all video gaming is bad and it's not, appropriate for kids. No, what this sort of talks about is moderation is important and the type of gaming is very important. And I think that that's what I wanted to say about specifically video gaming. Next slide, please. With regards to digital media use, I can give multiple presentations about social media and their use, but I think it's safe to say most of us now understand it's out there, in the media. Social media, electronic use, specifically social media, especially for teenage girls, is toxic. Meta and Facebook and Instagram and all these companies, they themselves from their own studies actually show that this stuff is toxic. There's lots and lots of studies that clearly show that the more excessive use, so we're talking like in the hours and hours and hours a day of social media use, it's associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, self-harming behavior, suicidal thinking, and attention deficits. So I think that's become a lot more common knowledge. This is a lot less common knowledge, and that's why I put it. I was actually a bit shocked about it as well. So they looked at ADHD symptoms in youth because we're seeing a lot more youth who are complaining of ADHD symptoms, but they actually don't have clinical like ADHD. So biologically, ADHD is a childhood disorder. It's a disorder that starts in early childhood, ages like 4, 5, 6. And then it depends on the severity. But the point is, it's a development problem that starts at a young age. In this study, they're showing that actually we're finding kids with no history of ADHD themselves, no family history of ADHD. There's nothing. And they grew up healthy. They grew up well. They did well in school. They didn't have attention or hyperactive problems. But as they hit junior high, high school, they started having these problems. And they were wondering why. And they found that there's a strong association with digital media use and ADHD. And I can even talk about this personally, like myself personally. I used to be able to, alhamdulillah, sit and read like a book for hours and study for hours. Now I can barely read for like 30 minutes. I'm just like, I get bored too easily. And what they found is that when you use social media and like multiple electronics, like tablets, TVs, video games, social media, YouTube, all this sort of stuff, you actually develop a very strong interrupted multitasking attention. It means you can give short bursts of attention to multiple tasks. You actually become much better at that. So they're very good at multitasking. But what you actually lose is called sustained uninterrupted attention, which is what you usually need to like do projects, to study long hours, to develop products, to be a lot more successful human being. And we're losing that ability. We're becoming very, even YouTube and TikTok and all this stuff, it's all small bursts of information, and like nobody can sit and listen to a lecture anymore. They just have to listen to the poll notes. So I found that very, very interesting, actually, and it's associated with digital media use. Next slide, please. So how do we deal with this stuff about social media? And again, if you guys recall, I said earlier in the session, like if our scholars said that if you're doing something positive, you can't be doing something negative at the same time. So the best way is not to get into these limits and boundaries and power struggles. A better way that I find is to replace that time with something that's more beneficial, like physical activity, doing tasks together, doing fun things together as a family, going out for walks, doing whatever, learning a hobby. That by definition will reduce the time. You still have to set limits. So, the key areas of limits would be things like no electronics during like dinner time, no electronics at nighttime, stuff like that can be quite helpful. Next slide, please. And I think this is very important as well, which is modeling behavior. I think a lot of the times we are the ones that have excessive electronic use and our kids just pick it up from us. So we have to be very self-conscious about how we use it, what we do with our time. We want our kids to read Quran. Do we read Quran in front of our kids, or do we read with them? We want our kids to go to the masjid. Do we go to the masjid with them? Like sometimes we create this sort of double standard, unfortunately, sometimes when it comes to our youth. Next slide, please. This is the last thing I want to talk about. I know we're like totally running out of time. I'm very, very sorry about that. I see this as an issue, and I wanted to talk about it because a lot of other things stem from it. And please forgive me, it's a little bit philosophical, but I think it's very important. I see lots and lots of youth who suffer from like depression and anxiety, and they suffer from this idea called existentialism. For those who don't know what existentialism means, existentialism is an atheistic philosophy that came out trying to understand what's the purpose of things in an atheistic model. And it's very kind of like what's the point, and why am I doing these things, and why, and a lot of youth suffer from what we call our existential crises. So they have points in their life where, for example, their parents get divorced, then they all of a sudden just don't know like how to function anymore in the world. They're like, why is this happening? Or if they get sick or something like traumatic happens to them, they get abused or something, they seem like they can't grasp why these things happen, because this model is an atheistic model. It doesn't provide any understanding to purpose. And when kids lose purpose, they lose motivation. When they lose motivation, their behavior changes, and they may or may not get depressed, but it causes lots of social problems. And then they don't care. They don't care about school. They don't care if they're using drugs. They take this don't care attitude. This stems from this philosophy. And what's very important, like I grew up in the West, what's very, very important to understand is the reality is, whether we like it or not, Western civilization in the past 100, 200 years, if not more, has been the hegemonist philosophy. They are the ones who are basically controlling the philosophical narrative of what to do and how to be successful and what it means to be motivated and all these things. Unfortunately, that's the reality. And the reality of their philosophy is based on two ideas. The first one is hedonism. Hedonism is an idea, a philosophical idea, that you maximize your pleasure and you minimize your harm, but not at the expense of others. Okay? It's basically, in a nutshell, maximizing your hawa without affecting other people, in a nutshell. And number two is naturalism. Naturalism is basically that we gain knowledge and information from our physical surroundings through our senses. So what that means is that if you look at those two philosophies, they're completely in contradiction with our Islamic understanding, which is, we're not hedonistic. We don't believe that our goal is to maximize our pleasure. Our goal is to maximize the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we gain through his pleasure and his mercy. And we're not naturalistic only. We do believe in physical science, and we accept science, and we deal with the world, but we also have metaphysics. We believe in the wahi, we believe in tawheed, we believe in things that are not measurable. We believe in ghaib, for example. We believe in logic and introspection. Those are all things naturalistic people, they decline. They don't follow. So this pits our youth in a situation where they're almost going to become like emotionally soulless, if that makes sense, from a religious aspect, because this is what the environment they're living in. Like I saw some, like there's this sister from Hong Kong, people from all aspects of like the Western world. This is the predominant philosophy, and this is the ideas that our kids are getting. And I just wanted us to get an awareness of this. This is what's going on. If we can go to the next slide, please. And because of this is what's going on, I think it's very important for our youth to connect with religion, not in the dogmatic, ritualistic ways. Yes, they need to pray, they need to fast, they need to do the rituals, but they also need the soul of the religion, if that makes sense. There's no soul in religion. And I worry that they're going to become like, like Christians. Christians don't have soul in their religion. They keep changing their religion. They keep, accepting things. They don't have boundaries just because social things have changed, but they just have their tuqus or their rituals. Yeah, you go to church on Sundays. Yeah, you pray, you do your daf, you pay or whatever, and you're done. There's no soul to it. So I put here Ibn al-Qayyim. Ibn al-Qayyim is one of the most prominent I would say, scholars, and a lot of his works are translated in multiple languages. And he was even described by Western philosophers and Western academics as, the doctor of the soul, the doctor of the heart, because he talks a lot about how religion and your heart and your soul are of utmost importance in your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think we just need to, next slide, please. I believe this is the last slide. Yeah, I put here Surah Al-Fatiha, like a lot of the times we just focus on, for example, memorizing Quran, but we have no understanding of the Quran. We're not connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't have a proper understanding. And just this surah by itself, there's actually a book Ibn al-Qayyim's written just about one verse number 4, Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. He's written an entire book on what that means. And it gives us depth and understanding. And I feel a lot of our youth, they kind of aimless, they seem like they have a lack of purpose, which can cause so many different problems. But if they feel grounded, they have a sense of purpose, they have a sense of understanding, they have a sense of mission in their life, which comes from our Quran and our Sunnah and our heritage, then they're a lot less likely to fall astray. Wallahu ta'ala alam. I think that's it. Jazakumullah khair. I think the last slide, just a thank you slide. So again, I'm very sorry for going. There is a lot to cover, and I hope I was able to cover a lot of your concerns, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, that was quite a talk, Dr. Saleem. In fact, I'm sure all of us will agree that we brought the issue to the table, and then we had just those short, doable tips that were easy for us to implement. And it's not just things that are good to hear but cannot be done. So alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khairan kaseera, Dr. Saleem, once again, for all of those tips and strategies, I would say. Now, yes, I'm sure all of you have tons of questions running across your mind, and as we had promised, we will have Dr. Saleem answer them, but I think we will just have 15 minutes or so. Is that okay with you, Dr. Saleem?
Yeah, no problem.
We'll take them. We take the questions. All of you can have your questions coming in the chat box. For the questions that have already come in, I'll just keep them out to you.
Yeah, I can see some of them. Some of them we've answered.
Yeah, so we have, starting from Sister Kashifa, would you please tell how to explain preteen children like 12 years old about the birds and the bees? How do we start this talk with them?
Yeah. So this is a really important topic. Again, we don't have a lot of time to cover everything, but issues around sexuality and menstruation and emotional drives. Number one, these conversations parents need to have, or at least someone, I know a lot of parents are very uncomfortable talking about this, or at least someone that very close to the family, like an aunt or uncle, someone in the community, whatever. The way this needs to be brought up, in my personal and humble opinion, is it's through our religion. Like, I actually learned most of these things through fiqh classes. So fiqh classes, they talk about janaba, they talk about tahara, they talk about menstruation, they talk about, wet dreams. They talk all about this stuff. And it's done in a way that is in a protected and a very proper way, if that makes sense. And it demystifies the thing, and it takes away the tension. And as we know, there's no haraj in religion. So I think that's the main way we should actually be approaching it. We should, if a daughter is coming up hitting her menstruation, or a boy's hitting puberty or whatever, we should start talking about it from a fiqh avenue. Okay, son, like, you're having these changes. Okay, now you're mukallaf, you're going to be responsible for your actions. This is what this means. Talking about like the menstruation, and that, you can't pray, you can't fast. This is how it starts, how it stops, and just being like open about it and talking without all this tension about these issues. And I know many parents, they just assume their kids will just figure it out, but that's, in my opinion, a major mistake. So using fiqh and understanding, and then actually, again, we talked about naming and taming. If your son or your daughter comes and says, I have a crush on a boy or a girl, or I feel this way, or whatever, connect with it. Say, yes, this is normal. It's fitri to feel this way. And Ibn al-Qayyim talks about this, about ishq, love, and lust. And this is okay. And we talk about boundaries, and we talk, when there is that connection, then they're a lot more likely to talk to you about it, and less likely to fall into haram.
Okay, so along similar lines, I would say opposite. How is it? Is the questions from Sister Asma Sheikh, and she says that how to deal with children who are talking about them being attracted to people of the same sex.
Yeah. This is a major kind of, I would say, a major fitna in our lifetime today about this whole thing about the LGBTQ and homosexuality and transgenderism. I have a big spiel about this, but I know we're running short on time. I don't know how much time we have, but this area needs to be explored because to just briefly answer your question, again, if someone has a homosexual feeling or thought even, again, we affirm it. Our religion doesn't allow us not to have negative thoughts. Yeah, we can have bad thoughts in our heads. So there's a lengthy hadith in Sahih Muslim, which is, I think, very important to understand, is that if someone has a bad thought, like I have a thought, an intention of committing a sin, or I have a negative intention to do something, but I don't do it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give me a reward for it. So if someone has a homosexual thought or a tendency or a feeling or whatever, I would say 9.9 times out of 10, these are things that are fleeting. This is part of our hawa, this is part of our emotions. They just sort of, they're thoughts and feelings that come to us. And being able to talk about it with a parent and then knowing the limit of it. It's just like talking about anything else that's inappropriate, right? To me, it's not any different if a youth says, oh, I have a homosexual feeling, or I have a lust feeling towards another girl, or vice versa. It's the same problem because both actions are impermissible, but the feeling itself, one is fitri, and maybe one isn't as much, but it's usually because of the society we live in, and we talked about the bi'a and the community and conformity, that this stuff is being pushed. It's literally being pushed down people's throats. I can say that about in Canada. I don't know about other places, but there's criminal clauses for people who reject this stuff for moral or religious grounds. So, I think it's really important to get some perspective that those feelings and those thoughts and those things, that's okay. And we need to know the boundaries and the limits of those things. And this is why we don't do these things or why we do these things. And just again, remember we have talked about the philosophy in the Western world is about hedonism. It's about hawa, right? And they are also very naturalistic. So where do they draw their evidence for being gay or transgender or whatever? They try to draw it from science. They bring science as their hijjah, as their excuse for it. But in reality, there was just a paper, it just came out like 2 or 3 months ago that I read in Nature, a very well-respected paper. There is no genetic or biological reason. Sexual behavior is predominantly driven by environment and social things. So that takes away that mystification and that justification that this is a scientific problem. It's not. It's a social issue. So if their society wants to be transgender and gay and whatever, that's their choice. And that's what they have. And we have other choices and we have other heritage. I hope that answers some of the question.
The next, a couple of questions on the same theme, that is, how can parents deal with sibling rivalry, especially with teens avoiding the younger kids?
Yeah, sibling rivalry, again, it's part of the process. I think being patient about it is very important, and not drawing comparisons. Comparisons really cause hatred and guilting, and and there are some kids that are extremely jealous, like even before their teenage years, they don't want to share anything with their sibling. They're very angry, very kind of upset about things with their siblings. And I think one of the things is to foster positive emotional memories with each other. So if they're constantly fighting, kind of restricting that so they don't fight as much, by getting them to do different activities, having separate rooms if that's possible, separate things, but then also fostering activities together that maybe both of them like biking, sports, activities, playing video games together, whatever, reading together, and trying to foster it. But they're difficult because it usually takes a couple of years for this stuff to get sorted out, and just recognizing that it can be quite normal.
Okay. Sister Aisha, she would like to know, how does one know when a depressed teen needs to be seen by a psychiatrist?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think if there's any one of the following 2 signs, if a child expresses suicidal thoughts, or they're like feeling like they need to hurt themselves, or they have hurt themselves and you find out they're hurting themselves, or that you notice significant functional decline. So just having symptoms on its own isn't enough. You can't, like, if it's a teen, it's like sad and a little bit depressed, and they may not eat as much, not sleep as much, but functioning, they're okay. They go to school, they do their tasks, they're kind of okay. We're less worried. But if they start having more of the objective biological things that you can see, and they're clearly biological, like sleep, energy, eating and appetite, if they're losing weight, if they're eating way too much, if they're not sleeping excessive amounts of hours, missing school, not getting out of bed, then I would say, you should be really seeking out medical attention.
The next one is from Sister Arshia. How to be friends with teenagers or preteens?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
How to be friends with our teenagers or preteens? So basically develop a friendly relationship with them.
Yeah, I don't, yeah. Again, I think that question in of itself is a bit problematic, because we've already established it's very hard to be friends with your teen, right? Like that they don't need friends at that time. They will reject you as their friend because you're their parent. They need to differentiate from you. Okay, I'm not saying this applies to this is not 100% obviously, but as a generalization, I would assume this is probably true. So they need friends from within your social circle. And you need to be more of a guidance and understanding, someone who is available and there for them, even though they won't appreciate it now, they'll appreciate it down the road. But being present, being available, being a listening ear, being supportive, that's what they really need in this, and guidance is what they need in this time. And then that friendship will start to build once they get, they start to differentiate, etc. And how do you build friendships? It's just like with any other friendships. You have similar goals, you have similar likes, you engage in nice behaviors, you share your thoughts, and you share like your time, and just like any other normal friendship. But I think in the teenage years, that comes a little bit later. Again, I could be mistaken, but generally speaking, teens want to sort of push a little bit away and have their own little friend structure, group. But you can also still be connected with them and doing activities that they enjoy with them. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. Ilya, she would like to know, how can we compel our teens to find the depth and soul and closeness to Allah through the Quran, considering what you said earlier, that the teens want to do opposite of what their parents say?
Yeah, exactly. And it is a really good question. That's why we talked about friendships, right? And وَالْإِنسَانُ عَلَى دِينِ خَلِيلِهِ, as Prophet said, that the person is on the religion of their very close friend. So a lot of the time, and that's why, there's in many communities across the globe, there are like, the Muslim youth communities or masajid have activities or all those things. And that's how they get connected with some positive friendships. And then you feel more comfortable, because if you try to compel them, they're just going to, 8 times out of 10 rebel, unless that started at a very young age. And I know Michael talked about that. That's a very important idea, topic that we should talk about as well for younger children. If you build the right blocks, it's a lot less likely that's going to be problematic. But even then, even if you do build the right blocks, there's still going to be some of the challenges. And I think that's why they need key friendships, relationships with righteous people. And we know that from many ahadith, that righteous company gives righteous behaviors. Ill company gives you ill behaviors. And I think that's a major challenge for many of us living in the West or in other areas. And just, if I may say, if anyone of you has the ability and the capacity to move to a Muslim country or to a much better Muslim community, even if it's in another Western country, but it's like a much larger community, or there's a lot more activities for, move. You don't just stay where you need to stay just because it's comfortable. You're putting your kids at risk. So, if you can move to a Muslim country, if you have friends, family, more social networks, if you live in some random town or village or a small city in the US and Canada or wherever in Europe, but you can go to a much bigger center and you have the opportunity to do so, then move. You should move, because the bia is very important.
We'll take 2 more questions. The first one being, how do we restrict teenagers from social media?
I think we answered that question. We gave some of the feedback about, doing other activities, There are programs where the parents can have knowledge, like their little apps, like parent control apps, I think are very important because you can actually see what your kid's seeing, and they need to understand that this stuff isn't like just your privacy and like your own free will. This stuff is toxic. It needs to be monitored. It's just like chlorine in the water in a swimming pool. It needs to be monitored by someone. You don't just dump a bunch of chlorine. But swimming is fun too, right? So we need to hit a balance. But I think we can go to another question, inshallah.
Yes, along similar lines, one of the sisters is asking for a book that would be given to a 16-year-old daughter to read on the ill effects of social media on mental health. So do we have a recommendation?
A book. I don't know, teenagers these days, mashallah, if she reads books, that's great. There is a Netflix documentary called Social Dilemma. I think that's had a very powerful impact on most people, to be honest. I watched it myself. The people who developed this stuff talk about it. So I think it's very compelling. It's called Social Dilemma. It's on Netflix, or you can just watch it wherever.
So the last question is how to deal with a child who is lazy and angry, always likes to be in control.
That's like a multi-question in one question. But the best thing that I can say at this time is maybe trying to explore, again, it's all about the whys, right? Why is this child so angry? Why is this child not engaging in the behaviors that they should be engaging in? Why is this child so controlling? Children who have control issues usually have very controlling parents. No offense to whoever asked the question, but I'm just speaking very generally. They want to establish control, or they themselves, they may have their own issues. Like if this has been a long-standing problem since a young age, maybe you should get them assessed. A lot of kids, for example, I saw a girl, she was 16, very, very, very wonderful girl, pleasant, everything, mashallah, like she's a normal kid, but she's very impulsive and very rigid when it comes to specific things, extremely rigid, to the point that, her parents can't deal with her. And they tried everything, and then they finally came to psychiatry. And when I saw her, she actually has Tourette's syndrome. So Tourette's syndrome is like kids that have like tics and twitchy movements in their face usually. And these kids, biologically, their executive functions are a little bit off. So they're extremely rigid, but at a young age. And, we just treated the Tourette's and she got much better. So it all depends. Is it a parenting issue? I don't know. Like the question needs a lot more exploration, but it's more about the why. Why is this child behaving this way? It's usually related to dynamics. It's related to maybe school issues, related to learning difficulties, related to issues around emotions, emotion regulation, or it runs in the families. A lot of times, boys have a lot of anger problems because their fathers have anger problems, or their uncles or grandfathers have anger problems.
Dr. Saleem, for taking out the time to give these valuable insights as well as answer those questions. Alhamdulillah. Dear parents, no one said that teenage state is going to be easy, but just as we've heard, with a few powerful tips and tricks and strategies and so on, you can try to overcome this phase and make it a memorable experience for yourself and for your child. With this, we come to the end of today's webinar, and Alhamdulillah, we thank you so much for being a part of this session. And just before you leave, here's some good news, inshallah. The WhatsApp group that was made for the webinar will now be converted into a parenting group where you all are free to discuss parenting issues and seek help from each other. And most important, we will try to get some of those questions answered from Dr. Saleem himself, or Brother Abdurrahman and Sister Floyd Adaza, time and again, inshallah, so that you have that expert advice coming in. And if you don't have the link to the group, we are posting it right away in the chat box. You can join in right now into the group, inshallah. Also, don't forget to sign up for the Muslim Kids TV and avail the 20% discount code on your way out, as the offer will last only for the next couple of hours. All right. So that's all from us, our lovely audience here on Zoom, as well as on YouTube. Hope you benefited from it, inshallah. May Allah bless this gathering and guide us to our practices that please Him, and eventually help us as families to get close to Him. I mean, Till we meet again in our next webinar. Take care, lovely parents. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خير.